Here's the Mindful Man reading a chapter from his book on Amazon KDP. I forgot the name of it now. What I'm going to do is keep reading because I haven't put in the chapters and see if I can do my longest ever film clip. Josh was so excited that he found it hard to sleep, and when he finally did, he was exhausted. He woke early and got ready as fast as he could. Tom was up, and they had a quick breakfast to set themselves up, and off wanted its freedom after being trapped in there for so long. They set off down the lane with chickens and cats rushing into the hedgerows, woken from their morning slumber. Josh bounced along in his seat with a smile on his face. It was the one thing in life he lived for: excitement. Tom asked Josh to turn on the radio, and it blinked orange and static noise filled their ears. He turned the dial slowly until he found something soothing, and the pleasant sounds of Chopin filled the car and mingled with the dawn chorus. Josh was so exhausted from lack of sleep that he fell asleep. When he woke, he was amazed to see the white cliffs before him and the sea spread out endlessly like a beautiful painting. He rubbed his eyes to make sure he wasn't dreaming, and a seagull landed on the bonnet of the car. Tom laughed. Magic, isn't it, son? It was easy for Josh to agree. Right, said Tom, let's explore. Time's a wasting, and they set off down the winding path to the beach. Josh loved hearing the caw of the seagulls. It was like being on Paradise Island. He breathed in the sea air and felt so alive that he imagined to be able to fly into the clouds. They were startled by a puffing noise behind them. A little train was behind, pulling a group of happy, smiling tourists. They moved out of its way as it wound its way down to the beach. We'll have to go on that, Tom said. Yes, said Josh. I wonder how far it goes. Daddy said we'll find out soon enough. Tom said, and they walked down to the beach. They took their shoes and socks off and felt the warm golden sand beneath their toes. It was a lovely feeling. The beach was filled up with people sunbathing. The smell of suntan oil was in the air. See that pier in the distance, Tom said, smiling. We're going to walk there. It was a long walk, at least a mile. Josh didn't mind. They walked along the beach as the waves slowly rolled in. The sky was effortlessly blue, like a painting. The pier was a dot in the distance and shimmered in the heat. Dad, said Josh, it's a shame we didn't pick up Grandad. I'm sure he would have loved to have come. In his haste to get away, Tom had forgotten. Oh, I feel bad, son, he said. It always amazed him how thoughtful Josh was. He felt blessed to have a son so considerate. We'll visit him on the way home, Tom said, feeling less guilty. I think it's time for an ice cream, Tom said, smiling. As they approached, a group of children, lovingly licking their lollies. They sat down on the steps for a rest, and it was a wonderful feeling. The cool ice cream on their parched, thirsty lips. Finally, they went to the pier and walked along the boardwalk, taking in the sights and sounds that swirled around them. People passed by twirling candy floss as music filled the air. Suddenly, the smell of vinegar flooded their nostrils. It's time for fish and chips, said Tom, and they sat on the steps, watching the people pass by happily, and occasionally tossing a stray chip to the hungry-looking seagulls. It was an endless day, and when they got to the end of the pier, they looked out at the never-ending sea. Dad, this is the best day of my life, said Josh, and Tom ruffled his hair proudly in agreement. By the end of the evening, they were so exhausted that they decided to get the tram back to the car. It was amazing looking down at the cliffs and the pier as the tram wound its way down. Tom passed the water and Josh drank hungrily. He really felt they had been on a great adventure, with the promise of more to come. I'll drive home slowly, said Tom, as he was exhausted. We can call in at Grandad's on the way, and he knocked on the door, full of the joys of spring, but there was no answer. Maybe he's fallen asleep, said Tom. They could see him in his favourite armchair. His pipe was beside him, smouldering, and the radio played softly. Tom went inside. Dad, said Tom, shaking his shoulders, but he didn't respond, so he shook him again more forcibly. Josh waited in the car. Tom checked Ronald's pulse. There was nothing. It was cold to touch. It was obvious he had been dead for a few hours. If only we'd have come round earlier, thought Tom. He turned round to look for the telephone among the piles of books and magazines, and he knocked a whiskey glass over. It shattered like his heart onto the floor. He told Josh, and they fell into stunned silence. Josh didn't cry, that would come later. It was surreal watching the ambulance drive away, but it was too late. That evening Josh couldn't sleep and he tossed and turned in a sea of memories. The next morning, over coffee, they talked of Ron and they both cried. It was a welcome relief. They hugged each other, but it was difficult to say anything to make them feel better. We were having such a good time, said Josh, and this has to happen. That's life, said Tom. It's cruel and unfair. That's why we have to stick together to help each other. Josh nodded and he knew he had to be strong. The next few days went by in a blur and no one wanted to think about the funeral, but it was coming like an iceberg in the distance. And when the day came, it passed in slow motion. It was like being in a surreal bad dream. Josh looked at the leaves falling from the trees as the coffin was lowered in the ground, and tears fell down his face. Tom put his arm on his shoulder as the vicar intoned, and the mourners walked away. That evening they reminisced about all the good times they had shared with Ron, and the hurt lessened a little. Over the next few days, Tom buried himself in his garage, polishing his beloved Mini and tinkering about. Josh knew he had to keep busy, and he wondered what to do to get through the day. Josh decided to head for the woods as it made him feel secure. He wanted space from the world to think and breathe. The shade of the overhanging trees gave him anonymity. I can't say anonymity. Oh my god! And his mood lifted when he disturbed a squirrel, and it shot up a tree at lightning speed. He loved the snap of the twigs, oh dear, and his feet under his feet, and the smell of the ferns in the forest. After 10 minutes tramping through, he heard a rush of water. As he got closer, he was surprised to see a river run unexpectedly through the forest. There was a group of older boys larking about in the water and shouting. Then were stepping stones along the shallow edge, and Josh inched his way over to them. When the boys saw him, they taunted him to swim across. He wasn't happy at all. He wasn't a strong swimmer. One of the older boys stood on the stepping stones with his arms folded stubbornly. Josh was wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and he realized he had no choice, and he edged closer to the water. He didn't want to do it, but when they started throwing stones at him and shouting obscenities, he had no choice. It wasn't as cold as he expected, and he slowly waded into the center of the river. He was worried about falling over as the floor was littered with rocks and pebbles and maybe even old bicycles to get tangled up in. The older boy fell about laughing at his predicament and the worried look on his face. Josh was not one to get angry easily, but for once he allowed himself to. His anger shot up like a thermometer, and this spurred him on to dive into the water and head for the riverbank. He was relieved not to be wearing a coat or t-shirt and socks to weigh him down. Just as he was swimming to the sandy bank, a large and ugly rat popped out of its hole and plopped into the water. This sent visions of fear through him. He was terrified of rats, and the thought of one swimming up to him filled him with horror. The riverbank was only 10 yards away, and he couldn't wait to get to the other side, and he redoubled his efforts. Then another large rat appeared and plopped into the water. This was too much. He swam more forcibly to the other side, and with each stroke, he imagined the rats circling and swimming beneath him. He was glad that the boys couldn't see the panic on his face. They would have been in hysterics. He finally got to the bank, but to his horror, he found that it was slipping, and he couldn't climb up it. Each time was more wet sand fell away, and he fell heavily into the water. Now he was starting to panic. He didn't want another hungry-looking rat to fall into the water. The boys were still shouting at him, but this time they must have been worried by his plight, and they began shouting words of encouragement and willing him to climb the river bank. Josh was becoming more tired, and the possibility of drowning entered his mind. More sand fell on his head and face, and the bank was crumbling to the touch. Once again he fell into the water. His clothes were weighing him down like an anchor, and he was starting to panic. He was wondering how Tom would react if he didn't arrive home. Just as his clothes were starting to pull him under the freezing water, a hand reached out to him unexpectedly, and he grabbed it and was hoisted out of the river, over the crumbling bank to safety. To Josh's surprise, he was the tallest and toughest one of the bunch. Sorry, kid, he said. We're just messing about. Josh brushed the wet sand from his clothes and managed a weak smile between gasps for breath. The other boys had stopped throwing stones at him and were now amusing themselves by climbing the highest and most dangerous-looking tree, and then jumping into the river with a splash. The older boy introduced himself as Chris, and he shook Josh's hand firmly. I'll leave that at that. Oh no, I'll keep going. Josh smiled. It felt good to be accepted, and it was a good feeling to be liked. Bye, he said as he marched off resolutely into the depths of the forest. The summer wind was drying his clothes as he walked, and the leaves on the ground soaked up the moisture from his pumps. Within 10 minutes it was dry as old wood, and he felt into his bag and remembered an apple he had saved there. He devoured it greedily, and with each bite his strength returned. He decided to walk to the other side of the forest, just to see what was there. He loved mystery and loved to get lost, but not too lost. The woods were slowly thinning out in front of him, and sunlight was streaming through the trees, and the sound of traffic was becoming clearer. For a small road there was lots of traffic, and Josh quickly crossed the road. His legs were tired, and he found running difficult. Luckily, there was a small pathway along the road, and he followed it until he got to a small estate. He was now ravenous with all the exercise, and was in serious need of a decent meal. Unfortunately, all he could afford was a sandwich. His mouth was watering at the prospect as he opened his favourite cheese and pickle. He sat on the bench and took a big bite. He couldn't eat quick enough. It was late in the afternoon, and he decided to have a look round. He found the church hall with posters on the wall, and one in particular caught his eye. Reading group. There was an address on the bottom, and he decided to investigate. Reading was something he loved, but he didn't do enough of it, and he was determined to catch up. The house wasn't hard to find, and he confidently knocked on the door. An unshaven man in a string vest opened it. Josh hurriedly explained the reason for his visit, and he was let in. Although he knew there was a risk visiting strangers' homes, he was relieved to see an attractive blonde woman reclining on the sofa with a drink in her hand. This was reassuring. Once inside, Josh felt nervous and he spoke quickly. Unfortunately, the book group had been cancelled that week, and the male of the house asked Josh if he wanted a drink. Yes, he replied that he was so thirsty. He sat in a comfy armchair and looked around. To his dismay, he noticed that there was a shotgun leaning against the wall. The man, whose name was Keith, brought him a drink, and as soon as Josh sipped it, he knew it wasn't water. It was strong and tasted like whiskey. Josh was so nervous that he kept sipping to calm his nerves. It was hard to keep his eyes off the gun, and they noticed. Don't worry, they said, we're on the run. From what? Josh said, feeling braver with the drink. They then explained that they had both been married to other people, and they had met and fell in love and ran away together. Unfortunately, the woman's angry husband wouldn't accept this, and he was still searching for them, waiting to enact his revenge. He was a very violent man, they said, and they needed to be prepared, hence the gun. To illustrate this, Keith picked up the gun and began cleaning it and opening and closed the barrel with scary enthusiasm. Josh gulped down more whiskey, and he tried not to talk too much, as his voice was quivering. The room was beginning to go fuzzy, and he was careful not to say anything to upset them. He really hoped the gun wasn't loaded. Keith picked up the gun and drunkenly pointed it around the room and pretended to pull the trigger, and with every verbal boom, his lady friend cackled and nearly fell off the chair. Maybe they are on the hot rice pudding, and Josh was ecstatic. I thought I'd treat you, said Tom, and ruffled his hair. From now on, we'll do all we can to make others' days special, he said. After all, life is short. I'll leave it there for a minute.